Yes, thank you. And thank you for all the interesting presentations so far. I think there's a little bit of overlap between my presentation and your first presentation, but that means it can only be quicker. Just as background information, Carbon Market Watch is an NGO based here in Brussels, and we scrutinize the carbon market developments internationally, but also at the EU level to ensure there's a fair and effective climate protection. If you go to the next slide, this was already highlighted before, but carbon pricing initiatives are expanding worldwide. So there is a sort of harmonization of a recognition that we need to put a price on carbon pollution and make the polluter pay. So at the moment, almost 40 countries and 20 regions in the world have implemented or will soon implement some form of carbon pricing. On the right is some information from ICAP, which shows that 2 out of 5 people worldwide live in a jurisdiction that has a carbon market, and soon almost 50% of our global economy, or jurisdictions responsible for almost 50% of the global economy, will have a carbon market. This will happen when China will implement its national carbon market probably next year. So in this sense, there is harmonization in the sense that more and more countries across the world are starting to put a price on carbon. However, how they do this exactly and how carbon markets are designed differs significantly between the regions and the different countries. This was also highlighted before again. It differs in terms of scopes, which sectors are covered. So in the EU, we cover the power and industry sector and aviation, but in other carbon markets, also agriculture is covered, for example, or transport, etc. It also differs in terms of what kind of price or quantity controls this carbon market exhibit. So in the Quebec, California carbon market, for example, you have a carbon floor and a floor price, while in the EU we have chosen for a quantity control, a market stability reserve. Also, in terms of what kind of offsets from sectors and countries that are not covered by a carbon market are allowed, there's differences in terms of where they can come from, but also in terms of how many of these credits you allow in the market. There are differences in terms of allocation methods. Do you give allowances away for free, and how do you distribute these free allowances to industry players, or do you auction allowances? And finally, I think also very importantly is they differ in terms of the ambition level, so the cap on the total number of emission allowances and how this cap is reduced over time. So all this is to say that full harmonization of all these design features is not easy. In fact, I think it's quite impossible, because these carbon markets are often tailored to national or regional circumstances. However, when talking about linking carbon markets, you don't need to have full harmonization of all these design features. However, I would say that differences in certain features may undermine the original objectives of the system and thereby make it more difficult to link to the other system. And this in particular applies to the ambition level, the use and quantity of international offsets, as well as to price or quantity controls. So what has been highlighted as the main benefit of linking different carbon markets is that it increases the pool of mitigation options, which can reduce costs for companies and thereby allow countries to increase their climate ambition. But paradoxically, while these lower abatement costs are an important economic motive for linking, they can also constitute a political barrier, because basically the citizens of the higher cost system, so the system with a higher carbon price, might be quite reluctant to pay for emission reductions in the other jurisdiction. And other political barriers include the ceding of some degree of national autonomy. When thinking, for example, of linking the EU ETS to the Chinese carbon market, this has severe implications, because any changes that will be made in the Chinese carbon market will have an effect also on EU's climate ambitions and EU's carbon market. So how do you still allow for a certain element of flexibility in your carbon market while still retaining some democratic control on any changes to the linked carbon market is a difficult question, I think. I think one of the things that was highlighted before in this regard is the linking between the Swiss and the EU ETS. What we've heard is that the linking negotiations between Switzerland and the EU to link their carbon markets have been concluded. So there is now a final linking agreement between these two countries, also including aviation. However, in terms of the lack of democratic control, the linking negotiations happening between Switzerland and the EU we didn't have any public participations. We didn't receive, as stakeholders, any information, at least from the EU side, in terms of what was happening, what was being negotiated. The only information that we received on how these negotiations were doing is from actually the Swiss government website. And now the linking has been concluded. It needs to be also approved by the European Parliament, so there is some democratic control. However, when requesting for the linking agreement, a member of the European Parliament was not granted access to see the linking agreement, at least not yet. So I think this is definitely an area to improve on in the future, especially when, I mean, Switzerland arguably has quite a small ETS, but when you talk about linking to China, to South Korea, or to bigger systems, this has a large political implication also for EU's climate emissions. So public participation and to have some transparency in this process, I think, is very, very important. As Carbon Market Watch, we see a very limited role of linking carbon markets in the short and medium term. What we see happening, I think, is linking of carbon markets at a regional level. So now EU, Switzerland, Canada, and the US in certain respects, maybe also in Asia. But due to different political circumstances, I think it's quite challenging to link with a carbon market in another part of the world. You need to have you need to have trust in the other system as well. So for the short and medium term, we don't see this happening. I mean, there will be a global carbon price in the sense that a lot of countries will have a carbon price, but it will not be covered by one carbon market, is our feeling. And in the long term, obviously, hopefully, we will not have a carbon market anymore because the industry and power sector have been completely decarbonized. However, I still think there can indeed be lessons learned from the EU ETS. I mean, the EU ETS is the world's largest carbon market. It has been in operation for over a decade. As NGOs, we would say it's still not functioning properly, and I've highlighted some of the problems that were identified with the EU ETS that can be useful perhaps also when developing carbon markets elsewhere in the world. First of all, the EU ETS has been oversupplied every year since its existence with emission allowances. It basically means that the cap on the emission allowance were set higher than actual emissions. A second problem that we have seen is that there has been a large inflow of cheap international offset credits, often with a low environmental quality. And finally, what we still see is a very low carbon price that is actually too low to be meaningful for fuel switching or the uptake of low carbon technologies. So some of these issues have indeed been tackled now with the new reform and the market stability reserve. For example, after 2021, international offsets will not be allowed anymore. We have a market stability reserve that at least will temporarily deal with the oversupply of emission allowances. But in certain other respects, such as the low carbon price, I don't think there is a permanent solution yet, although there has recently been talk of also introducing a price floor in the EU, at least by the French. Some of these things I think were also mentioned by you before, but we can also learn from other carbon markets, or maybe the other carbon markets have learned from the mistakes or the lessons learned from the EU ETS. For example, Quebec and California has a carbon floor price, which means that the price in this system is higher than in the EU. In California, they tried to tackle the fact that offsets could have very low environmental quality by having these buyer liability rules, which basically means that if you buy an offset with a low quality or too low quality, that means that you are obliged to buy new ones in case the authority finds out that they did not result in meaningful emission savings. The US RGGI system is a system for the power sector in certain states, and they include a mechanism to reduce future caps for bank surplus allowances. This is also very interesting, and I think maybe this is still relevant also for the EU ETS after 2020. I don't think, basically, to conclude maybe, that there has been a lack of ideas in terms of how to improve the EU ETS or all the other carbon markets around the world. There has been, at least from the EU side, what we can see, a lack of political will indeed to make these changes. This is partly due to vested interests and quite a large lobby apparatus here in Brussels. And I think it would be indeed very interesting to see how in other regions it has been done, at least specifically in regions with a similar political system, or maybe not even as in the EU. But how do you tackle this? How do you make sure that all these ideas to make it a better carbon market actually become a reality? Finally, there's 2 of the briefings we have done last year on linking carbon markets, if you want to know more. Thanks.